The scream tore through Ashworth Manor at midnight, and every servant froze where they stood. Duke Alexander Ashworth was already running before the second scream came, his bare feet slapping against cold stone floors, his heart hammering with a fear he thought he had buried 3 years ago. He knew that sound. He knew it in his bones. It was the sound that had haunted his sleep since the night he lost everything. He reached the third-floor landing and stopped dead. The nursery door, the door that had remained locked and untouched for 3 long years, stood wide open. Lamplight spilled out into the dark hallway like a wound that refused to close. His hands began to shake. No one was allowed in that room, no one. He had given strict orders the very week his wife and infant son had been taken from him, and in 3 years, not a single soul in his household had dared to disobey. Until tonight. He pushed the door open the rest of the way, his breath caught in his throat, and there she was. Eleanor Whitfield, the new governess who had arrived only 4 days earlier, stood in the center of the nursery with a small wooden horse clutched in her hands and tears streaming down her face. She was not screaming from fear. She was screaming from grief, from a sorrow so raw it had ripped out of her before she could stop it. And somehow, impossibly, that sound had matched his own sorrow so perfectly that for one terrible moment, Alexander could not tell whose pain he was hearing. "Who gave you permission," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "to enter this room?" Eleanor turned to face him, and instead of the fear he expected, he saw something else in her eyes. Understanding. Recognition. As if she had seen straight through the cold mask he wore every single day and found the broken man hiding underneath it. "I am sorry, Your Grace," she whispered. "I heard crying. I thought a child was in danger." "There is no child in this house," he said, and the words came out sharper than he intended, sharper than he had spoken to anyone in a very long time. "There has not been a child in this house for 3 years." The silence that followed was heavier than anything Eleanor had ever felt. She looked around the room properly for the first time, and her heart broke all over again. A cradle sat untouched beneath the window, draped in a fine white cloth gone yellow with age. Tiny gowns hung in an open wardrobe, exactly as they must have been left. A rocking chair sat facing the empty crib, as though someone had been sitting there only moments before, waiting for a child who would never come. This was not merely a locked room. This was a tomb of memory, frozen in the exact second tragedy had struck, and no one in the household had dared to touch it since. "Leave," Alexander said quietly, "now." Eleanor set down the wooden horse with trembling hands and hurried past him, but as she reached the door she paused. She did not know this man. She had been in his home only 4 days, and yet something about the depth of pain in his eyes made her stop. "Your Grace," she said softly, "grief kept in silence for too long does not heal. It only grows heavier." He did not answer her. He simply stood in the doorway of his son's nursery, staring at the small cradle he had built with his own hands before his world collapsed, and said nothing at all until she had gone. That night, Eleanor lay awake in her small room on the 2nd floor, unable to stop thinking about what she had seen. She had taken this position out of necessity. Her father's debts had left her with almost nothing, and a respectable position as governess to a duke's young ward was more than she had dared hope for. She had expected long hours and a demanding household. She had not expected to stumble into the middle of a broken man's private sorrow on her 4th night in his home. She thought of the little girl she had been hired to teach, 7-year-old Grace, the duke's niece, sent to live at Ashworth Manor after her own parents had passed from fever the previous winter. Grace was bright and curious, but there was a sadness in her too, a quietness that no child her age should carry. Eleanor had noticed it immediately. The whole house seemed to breathe sorrow, from the shuttered windows on the west wing to the servants who spoke in hushed voices whenever the Duke's name came up. The next morning, Eleanor rose early and made her way to the schoolroom, determined to focus on her actual duties and put the previous night out of her mind. Grace was already waiting for her, sitting by the window with a book held upside down, clearly not reading it at all. "Good morning, Grace," Eleanor said gently, taking a seat across from her. Shall we begin with arithmetic today, or would you prefer stories first? Stories, Grace said immediately, and for the first time since Eleanor's arrival, the girl actually smiled. They spent the morning reading together, and slowly, carefully, Eleanor began to draw the child out of her shell. She learned that Grace missed her parents terribly, that she was frightened of the Duke because he rarely spoke to her, and that she had heard the older servants whisper about a baby who used to live in the house. "Do you know about the baby?" Grace asked suddenly, setting her book down. Eleanor's chest tightened. "I know very little," she admitted honestly, "only that it makes your uncle very sad." "Everyone says I must never ask him about it," Grace said. "Mrs. Bennet told me if I ever mentioned the nursery, Uncle Alexander might send me away." "He would never do that," Eleanor said, though she had no real way of knowing such a thing. Still, something in her wanted desperately to reassure the child. "Your uncle is grieving, Grace. Sometimes grown people carry sadness so heavy that they forget how to be gentle, even when they want to be." Grace considered this for a long moment. "Do you think he will ever stop being sad?" Eleanor thought of the man standing in the nursery doorway the night before, his voice breaking even as he tried to sound cold and commanding. She thought of the rocking chair facing the empty crib, and the wooden horse she had picked up without thinking, and the desperate ache she had felt looking at a room that had been left exactly as it was on the worst day of a father's life. "I hope so," she said quietly. "I truly hope so." Later that afternoon, Eleanor was summoned to the Duke's study, and her stomach twisted with dread the entire walk down the long corridor. She fully expected to be dismissed. She had broken the one rule of the household that mattered most, and she had done so on her 4th day of employment. She rehearsed apologies in her mind, searching for the right words that might convince him to let her keep her position, if only for Grace's sake. When she entered the study, Alexander was standing by the window with his back to her, his hands clasped behind him. The afternoon light caught the gray already threading through his dark hair, though he could not have been much older than 30. He looked, she thought, like a man carved from stone, and yet the shadows beneath his eyes told a different story entirely. "Your Grace," she said, curtsying, "you wish to see me." He turned slowly. His expression was unreadable, guarded in the way that only deep pain could teach a person to be. "Miss Whitfield, I owe you an apology." Of everything she had prepared herself to hear, this was not it. Eleanor blinked. "Your Grace." "I spoke to you harshly last night," he said. "You were not at fault. The door should not have been unlocked. It seems a maid left it open while airing the room, a task I did not authorize and will address separately." He paused, and something flickered across his face, quick and painful. "You could not have known what that room meant. I should not have taken my anger out on you." Eleanor stood very still, unsure how to respond to an apology from a man everyone in the household clearly feared. "Thank you, Your Grace. I am only sorry for the intrusion. I never meant to cause you pain." "You did not cause it," he said, his voice quieter now. "It has been there for 3 years. You merely happened to witness it." There was a long silence between them, filled with things neither of them seemed ready to say aloud. Finally, Alexander cleared his throat and gestured toward the chair across from his desk. "Sit, please. I would like to discuss Grace's education, if you are willing to remain in my employment." Relief flooded through her, though she was careful not to let it show too plainly on her face. "Of course, Your Grace, I am happy to remain." They spoke for nearly half an hour about lesson plans and Grace's progress, and Eleanor found herself surprised by how thoughtfully he listened, how genuinely he seemed to care about his niece's happiness despite his own suffering. There was a gentleness buried somewhere beneath his cold exterior, a gentleness she suspected very few people ever saw. As she rose to leave, she paused at the door, unable to stop herself from speaking one final thought aloud. "Your Grace, if I may say one more thing." He looked up, and though his expression remained guarded, he did not refuse her. "Grace loves you very much," Eleanor said. "She only wishes you would let her see it matters to you too." She left before he could respond, her heart pounding with the boldness of what she had just said to a duke she had known for only 4 days. But as she walked back toward the schoolroom, She could not shake the feeling that something in that house, something that had been frozen for 3 long years, had just begun, ever so slightly, to shift. Behind her, in the quiet of his study, Alexander sat motionless for a long time, staring at the door through which the young governess had disappeared. He thought of the nursery, of the cradle he had built with hands that once believed in a future full of laughter. He thought of his wife's voice, and the tiny cry of a son he had held only once before losing him forever. He had promised himself, on the day he buried them both, that he would never open his heart again. Love had cost him everything. He would not risk that kind of devastation a second time. And yet, for reasons he could not explain, he found himself thinking not of his loss, but of the fierce, unguarded compassion in a governess's tear-filled eyes as she stood in his son's empty nursery, mourning a child she had never even known. It unsettled him deeply. It also, though he would never have admitted it to a single soul, made him feel something he had not felt in 3 long years. He felt seen. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, and by the time Elinor found out about it, the entire household had already gone quiet with dread. She was walking Grace back from their morning lesson in the garden when she noticed Mrs. Bennet standing at the bottom of the front steps, wringing her apron in her hands, her face pale as chalk. Elinor had been at Ashworth Manor for nearly 3 weeks now, long enough to know that Mrs. Bennet only wrung her apron like that when something was terribly wrong. "What has happened?" Elinor asked, tightening her grip on Grace's small hand. "Lord Harcourt is coming," Mrs. Bennet said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He sent word this morning. He arrives within the fortnight." Grace looked up at Elinor with wide, frightened eyes, and Elinor felt her own stomach drop, though she did not yet understand why the name alone could cause such fear in a grown woman's face. "Who is Lord Harcourt?" Elinor asked carefully. Mrs. Bennet glanced toward the house, as though worried the walls themselves might carry word back to the Duke. "He is his Grace's cousin, next in line for the title should anything ever happen to the Duke, seeing as there is no direct heir." She lowered her voice further. "He has wanted this estate for years, miss. Ever since the tragedy, he has circled this family like a vulture waiting for its chance." Elinor's mind raced. She thought of the locked nursery, of the small cradle gathering dust, and understood with sudden clarity what losing his son had truly cost Alexander. It was not only his heart that had broken. It was also, in the coldest and most practical sense, his future, his line, everything a duke was meant to protect and pass on. "Does the Duke know he is a threat?" Elinor asked. "His Grace knows everything about that man," Mrs. Bennet said grimly. "And he trusts him not 1 inch, but Lord Harcourt is clever. He always finds a reason to visit that seems perfectly innocent, and he always leaves having stirred up some trouble that takes months to settle." That evening, Elinor found herself unable to concentrate on the book she was meant to be reading in the small parlor near the schoolroom. Grace had gone to bed hours ago, and the house had settled into its usual heavy silence, but something about the news of Lord Harcourt's visit left her restless. She was surprised, therefore, when a soft knock came at the parlor door, and even more surprised to find Alexander himself standing in the doorway, still dressed from the day, his cravat loosened and his expression unusually open. "Miss Whitfield, I hope I am not intruding." "Not at all, Your Grace." She set her book aside and rose, though he waved a hand for her to sit again, and after a moment's hesitation he took the chair across from her, which she had never once seen him do. "You have heard, I imagine, that my cousin is coming to visit." "I have, Your Grace." He studied her for a long moment, as though weighing how much to say. "Edmund Harcourt is not a man to be trusted lightly. He will be charming. He will be generous with compliments and gifts, particularly toward Grace, and particularly, I suspect, toward you." Elinor's cheeks warmed slightly at the implication, though she kept her voice steady. "Why toward me, Your Grace?" "Because he is clever enough to know that the fastest way into this household's confidence is through the people I trust." Alexander's jaw tightened. "I do not trust easily, Miss Whitfield. You may have noticed." "I had noticed," she admitted, and to her surprise the corner of his mouth lifted just slightly in something almost like humor. "And yet," he continued, "in 3 weeks you have earned more of my trust than most people manage in 3 years. I would ask you to be careful with my cousin. Not because I doubt your judgment, but because he is skilled at finding the softest places in people and pressing until they break." Elinor felt something warm bloom in her chest at his words, though she was careful not to let it show too plainly. "I will be careful, Your Grace. Thank you for the warning." He nodded, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, and the rain had begun to patter gently against the windows, and Elinor found herself acutely aware of how close he was sitting, how the guarded coldness that usually surrounded him like armor seemed, in this quiet moment, to have softened just slightly. "May I ask you something, Your Grace?" she said finally. "You may. Grace tells me you rarely speak of her mother, your sister. Were the two of you close?" Something flickered across his face, grief layered over grief. "We were very close once. Margaret was 3 years younger than I when she and her husband passed last winter. I could not attend the funeral in time." He paused, and his hands, resting on his knees, curled slightly. "I was not well at the time. It had only been 2 years since I lost my own family, and the news of Margaret's death nearly broke what little was left of me." "I am so sorry," Elinor said softly. "Grace does not know how close I came to failing her entirely," he said, his voice rough. "When she arrived here, I could barely look at her without seeing my own son, the age he might have been, the child I never had the chance to raise. It shames me to admit that I was distant with her at first. I did not know how to be near a child again without falling apart." Elinor's heart ached for him, for the little girl upstairs who had lost so much and arrived in a home shadowed by grief she did not understand, and for the man in front of her who had been trying, in his own broken way, to protect himself from a pain he could not survive twice. "She adores you," Elinor said gently. "Whatever distance you feared you created, she has not felt it as rejection. She has felt it as sadness, and children are remarkably good at understanding sadness, even when they cannot name it." Alexander looked at her, then with an expression she could not quite decipher, something between gratitude and wonder. "You have a gift, Miss Whitfield, for saying exactly the words a person did not know they needed to hear." "I only speak honestly, Your Grace." "That," he said quietly, "is rarer than you might think." They spoke for a while longer about Grace's lessons, about small matters of the household, and though nothing more significant passed between them that evening, Elinor returned to her room afterward with her heart beating strangely, unable to stop replaying the softness in his voice when he had admitted his fears to her, a stranger he had known for barely 3 weeks. The following days passed in a strange, charged quiet, the entire household bracing itself for Lord Harcourt's arrival like sailors watching a storm gather on the horizon. Elinor threw herself into Grace's lessons, trying to keep the girl's spirits light despite the tension that had settled over the manor, but she could not shake the unease Mrs. Bennet's warning had planted in her. She began, in her free hours, to explore the house more thoroughly, partly out of curiosity and partly, she admitted to herself, because she wanted to understand the man she found herself thinking of far too often. In the West Wing, she discovered a portrait gallery she had not yet seen, and among the paintings of stern ancestors, she found one that stopped her in her tracks. A young woman with warm brown eyes and a gentle smile, dressed in soft blue, stood beside a much younger Alexander, his arm around her waist, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. Beneath the portrait, a small brass plate read simply, "Charlotte, Duchess of Ashworth." Elinor stood before the painting for a long time, studying the joy on Alexander's face, a joy so different from the careful, guarded man she knew now that it was almost like looking at a stranger. She wondered what it must have felt like to lose not only a wife, but the version of himself that had once been capable of such open, unguarded happiness. "She was kind," a voice said behind her, and Elinor turned to find Alexander standing a few feet away, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on the portrait rather than on her. "I did not mean to intrude, Your Grace," Alina said quickly, stepping back from the painting. "I was simply exploring the house." "You are not intruding." He moved closer until he stood beside her, both of them looking up at the painted image of his late wife. Charlotte had a way of making everyone she met feel as though they were the most important person in the room. Servants adored her. She remembered every name, every birthday, every small detail of a person's life that most nobility would never bother to notice. "She sounds remarkable." "She was." He was quiet for a moment. "We were married 5 years before she conceived. I had nearly given up hope of ever having a family, and then, quite suddenly, she was carrying our son. I have never in my life been as happy as I was during those months of waiting." Alina said nothing, sensing that he needed the space to continue without interruption. "The birth was difficult," he said, his voice growing quieter, more strained. "The physician warned us there might be complications, given her age and her health, but Charlotte insisted everything would be well. She was always so certain of good things. It was, I think, the thing I loved most about her." He paused, and Alina watched his throat move as he swallowed hard. "William was born alive, small but alive. Charlotte held him for perhaps an hour before the fever took her." "Alexander," Alina whispered, forgetting formality entirely, but he did not seem to notice, or if he did not mind. "I held my son for 3 weeks," he continued, his voice barely above a breath now. 3 weeks of believing, foolishly, desperately, that he would survive when his mother had not, and then the same fever that took her found him too, and I. He stopped entirely, his composure finally cracking, and Alina, without thinking, without considering propriety or position or anything at all beyond the raw grief in front of her, reached out and took his hand. He did not pull away. They stood together in the portrait gallery, hand in hand, saying nothing at all, while outside the rain continued to fall and somewhere in the house. A clock struck the hour, marking the passage of time that Alexander Ashworth had spent 3 long years trying desperately to stop. 2 days later, Lord Edmund Harcourt arrived at Ashworth Manor in a carriage far too fine for the muddy country roads, and Alina understood within the first 5 minutes of his arrival exactly why Mrs. Bennet feared him so deeply. He was, without question, charming. He greeted the staff by name, though he had not visited in over a year, and he swept into the drawing-room with a warmth and easy laughter that seemed entirely at odds with the cold, calculating look Alina caught in his eyes, whenever he thought no one was watching him closely. "Cousin," he said, embracing Alexander with the familiarity of a man who considered himself family in every sense that mattered, though Alexander's return of the gesture was noticeably stiff. "You look well." "Better than I expected, if I am honest." "Edmund," Alexander said evenly, "you did not mention the reason for your visit in your letter." "Must there always be a reason?" Edmund laughed lightly, though his eyes flicked briefly toward Alina, standing near the doorway with Grace's small hand in hers. "Perhaps I simply missed my family." His gaze lingered on Alina a moment too long, and she felt an unpleasant chill settle over her, despite his pleasant smile. "And who is this lovely addition to the household?" Edmund asked, stepping forward with an exaggerated bow. "Miss Whitfield," Alexander said, his voice carrying a note of warning that only Alina, having come to know him these past weeks, could recognize. "Grace's governess." "Ah, of course," Edmund's smile widened. "A pleasure, Miss Whitfield. I do hope we shall become well acquainted during my stay." Alina curtsied politely, saying nothing, though every instinct in her urged caution. She could feel Alexander watching the exchange closely, his jaw tight, and she understood, without a single word passing between them, that whatever game Edmund Harcourt intended to play during his visit, they would need to face it together. By the 3rd day of Lord Harcourt's visit, Alina had learned to dread the sound of his footsteps in the hallway. He had a way of appearing wherever she happened to be, always with some innocent excuse, always with that same easy smile that never quite reached his eyes. She found him in the library when she went to select a book for Grace's lessons. She found him in the garden when she took Grace for her afternoon walk. She found him, most unsettling of all, waiting outside the schoolroom door one afternoon when Grace had gone ahead to fetch her slate. "Miss Whitfield," he said, blocking her path with a smile that felt more like a closing trap than a greeting. "How fortunate! I had hoped for a private word." "I am afraid I must attend to Grace, my lord," Elinor said, attempting to step past him. "This will only take a moment." He did not move. "I understand your father was a man named Charles Whitfield of Sussex." Elinor's blood ran cold. She had not spoken her father's full name to a single soul at Ashworth Manor. "How do you know that name, my lord?" Edmund's smile deepened, satisfied, as though he had been waiting for exactly this reaction. "I make it my business to know a great many things, Miss Whitfield. Your father, God rest him, left behind debts of considerable size before his passing, debts that were purchased, quite recently, by a gentleman of my acquaintance." "What are you suggesting?" Elinor's voice remained steady, though her heart was pounding wildly. "I am suggesting nothing at all," he said smoothly. "I am simply informing you of a fact. Those debts could be forgiven quite easily, or they could be called in quite suddenly, depending entirely on circumstances." He paused, letting the threat settle fully before continuing. "It would be a shame for a young woman of your evident quality to find herself, and her remaining family, thrown into debtor's prison over a matter that could so easily be resolved." Elinor's mind raced, searching for the threat hidden beneath his pleasant tone. "What is it you want from me, my lord?" "Distance," he said simply. "From my cousin. I have watched the two of you these past days, Miss Whitfield, and I am not a fool. Alexander has not looked at a woman the way he looks at you in 3 years. If that attachment continues to grow, it complicates certain matters considerably." "What matters?" "The succession, Miss Whitfield. Should my cousin remain childless and unmarried, the title and everything attached to it passes to me upon his death. It is a simple matter of law. A governess-turned-duchess, however, particularly one who might give him an heir, would end that possibility entirely." His eyes glittered coldly. "I would prefer that possibility remain closed." Elinor stared at him, disgust and fear warring inside her chest. "You would threaten my family over an inheritance you have not yet earned." "I would ensure my future," Edmund corrected smoothly. "As any reasonable man would. Consider my offer carefully, Miss Whitfield. Distance yourself from my cousin, and your father's debts will trouble you no further. Continue as you are, and I cannot promise the same courtesy." He gave a small, elegant bow and walked away, leaving Elinor standing frozen in the corridor, her hands trembling at her sides. She did not tell Alexander that evening. She told herself it was because she needed time to think, but in truth, she was terrified. Terrified of what might happen to her family's already tarnished name if Edmund carried out his threat, and terrified, too, of a feeling she had been trying desperately not to name these past weeks, a feeling that had grown despite every effort she made to suppress it. She was falling in love with the Duke of Ashworth, and Edmund Harcourt had just made it devastatingly clear how dangerous that could be for everyone she cared about. The following morning brought further complications in the form of Lady Constance Ashworth, Alexander's aunt, who arrived unannounced in a flurry of silk skirts and sharp opinions, her carriage nearly colliding with Edmund's own in the drive. "Alexander," she declared, sweeping into the drawing-room without waiting to be announced, "I have heard the most alarming rumors, and I have come to see for myself whether there is any truth to them." "Aunt Constance." Alexander's greeting held the particular weariness of a man who had dealt with this woman's opinions his entire life. "To what rumors do you refer?" "That you have taken up with your niece's governess," Constance said bluntly, her sharp eyes finding Elinor immediately across the room, where she stood with Grace's schoolbooks in her arms. "A common practice, I grant you, and hardly scandalous on its own, but given your position, given the succession." "Aunt, that is quite enough," Alexander said, his voice carrying a warning edge that made even Constance pause. "I am only thinking of your interests," Constance continued, though she lowered her voice slightly. "You are the last Ashworth of your line, Alexander. Your duty to this family did not die with Charlotte and William, however painful that truth may be. You must marry, and you must marry appropriately. A governess, however pleasant she may seem, is not an appropriate match for a duke. Alina felt heat rise to her face, mortified to be discussed so openly, as though she were not standing directly within earshot. Grace, sensing the tension, pressed closer against Alina's side, and Alina placed a steadying hand on the girl's shoulder. "Miss Whitfield is Grace's governess," Alexander said firmly. "Nothing more has been decided, and nothing more is any of your concern, Aunt." Constance's sharp gaze lingered on Alina a moment longer, assessing, calculating, before she turned back to her nephew. "Very well, but do consider, Alexander, what people will say. What they always say, when a man of your position forgets himself over a pretty face with no fortune to speak of." The words stung more than Alina cared to admit, but she kept her expression carefully neutral, refusing to give Lady Constance the satisfaction of seeing how deeply the insult had landed. That evening, after Grace had been put to bed, and the house had settled into its usual quiet, Alina found herself walking alone through the gardens, trying to clear her mind of the day's events. The threats from Edmund, the insults from Lady Constance, the growing, undeniable feelings she carried for a man who was, by every rule of society, entirely beyond her reach. It all pressed down on her like a physical weight, and she welcomed the cool night air against her face as she walked among the roses, trying to steady herself. "I did not expect to find you out here so late," Alexander's voice said from somewhere behind her, and she turned to find him approaching, his expression troubled. "I needed air, Your Grace." "Alexander," he corrected gently. "You called me by my name once in the gallery. I found I did not mind it." She managed a small, tired smile. "Alexander, then." He came to stand beside her, and for a moment they simply looked out over the darkened garden together, the silence between them comfortable despite everything weighing on both their minds. "My aunt was cruel to you today," he said finally. "I am sorry for that. She means well in her own misguided way, but her manner of expressing concern leaves much to be desired." "She is not wrong," Alina said quietly. "I have no fortune, no family name of any significance. Whatever she fears, she has reason to fear it." Alexander turned to face her fully. "What she fears is losing control over decisions that are entirely mine to make. I have spent 3 years letting grief dictate every choice in my life, Alina. I am not inclined to let my aunt's opinions dictate the next 3. Her heart stuttered at the use of her given name, spoken so easily, so warmly in the dark quiet of the garden. "There is something I must tell you," she said suddenly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. She told him then everything about Edmund's threat, about her father's debts, about the terrible choice she had been forced to consider between protecting her family and following her own heart. Alexander's expression darkened as she spoke, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "He threatened you, in my own home." "He is trying to protect his inheritance," Alina said, though even as she spoke the words, she recognized how little sympathy she truly held for Edmund Harcourt's position. "He is trying to control my life through fear, exactly as he has always done." Alexander's voice was hard now, the softness of a moment ago replaced entirely by cold fury. "Your father's debts, whatever they may be, will be resolved by my own hand before the week is out. Edmund will hold no power over you, Alina. I promise you that." "You do not owe me such a promise," she said softly, though gratitude and something far warmer swelled in her chest at his words. "I am not making this promise out of obligation," Alexander said, stepping closer, close enough that she could see the sincerity burning in his eyes even in the dim light. "I am making it because the thought of you suffering, on my account or Edmund's, is not something I am willing to accept." They stood close together in the quiet garden, the space between them charged with everything neither of them had yet dared to say aloud, and for one breathless moment, Alina thought he might close that final distance entirely. But then, from somewhere near the house, a door opened, and voices carried across the night air, and the moment shattered as quickly as it had formed. Alexander stepped back, his composure returning like a mask sliding back into place, though his eyes remained locked on hers a moment longer than propriety strictly allowed. "Good night, Alina," he said softly. "Good night, Alexander," she whispered back, and watched him walk away into the darkness, her heart pounding with a hope she barely dared to feel. True to his word, Alexander sent for his solicitor the very next morning, and within 3 days, word came back that Charles Whitfield's debts had been settled in full, quietly and without fanfare. The paperwork transferred entirely out of the hands of whichever creditor Edmund had arranged to purchase them from. Alina learned of it not from Alexander himself, who mentioned it only briefly and without any expectation of thanks, but from Mrs. Bennet, who had heard the news from the solicitor's own clerk, and could not contain her delight at seeing Lord Harcourt's scheme so thoroughly undone. "He will not take that well," Mrs. Bennet warned, even as she smiled. "A man like that does not simply accept defeat, miss. You would do well to watch yourself carefully in the days ahead." Mrs. Bennet's warning proved prophetic. Edmund's charm, which had never fully convinced Alina to begin with, curdled almost overnight into something colder and more calculating. He no longer sought her out directly, but she began to notice him watching her from across rooms, his expression unreadable, and she felt certain he was simply waiting, patient as a spider, for a new opportunity to strike. That opportunity arrived on a wet, gray afternoon, when Grace fell ill with a fever that climbed alarmingly fast, leaving the entire household in a state of quiet panic. Alina sat at the child's bedside for hours, pressing cool cloths to her burning forehead, while the physician was sent for and the staff moved through the house with hushed, worried voices. Alexander appeared in the doorway within the hour, his face pale with a fear Alina recognized immediately, the same fear she had seen in him the night she first entered the locked nursery. This illness, however ordinary it might prove to be, had clearly reopened wounds he had spent 3 years trying to close. "How is she?" he asked, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "The fever is high, but she is fighting it," Alina said gently, making room for him at the bedside. "The physician has been sent for. Try not to fear the worst, Alexander." He sat beside the bed and took Grace's small hand in his, and Alina watched something break open in him, some final wall crumbling as he looked at the sick child before him, seeing perhaps not only his niece, but every fear he had carried since losing his own son to a fever no one could stop in time. "I cannot lose her too," he whispered, so quietly Alina almost did not hear it. "I cannot survive that again." "You will not have to," Alina said firmly, taking his other hand without thinking, offering what comfort she could. "Grace is strong, and she has people who love her fighting for her. This is not the same as before, Alexander. This is not William." He looked up at her sharply at the mention of his son's name, spoken so gently, so without fear, and something in his expression shifted, grief and gratitude mingling together in his tired eyes. They kept vigil together through the night, taking turns pressing cool cloths to Grace's forehead, murmuring soft reassurances even when the child was too fevered to respond. And by dawn, when the physician finally arrived to confirm that the fever had begun to break, Alina and Alexander sat side by side at the bedside, exhausted and relieved, their hands still joined together as though neither had thought to let go. "Thank you," Alexander said quietly, once the physician had departed with instructions for Grace's continued care. "For staying. For not leaving me to face this alone." "I would not have wanted to be anywhere else," Alina said honestly, and meant every word. It was during Grace's slow recovery over the following days that Edmund Harcourt made his move, and this time, his target was not Alina directly, but Alexander himself. Alina learned of it when she was summoned once more to the study, this time finding not only Alexander but Lady Constance present as well, both of their expressions grim. "Miss Whitfield," Alexander said, his voice tight with barely restrained anger, "Edmund has made an accusation against you, one I must address directly." Alina's stomach dropped. "What accusation, Your Grace?" "He claims," Lady Constance said, her tone carrying less of her usual sharpness and more genuine concern than Alina had yet heard from her, That you have been deliberately encouraging Grace's illness to remain in this household longer, to secure your position through sympathy rather than merit. He suggests you may even have contributed to her falling ill in the first place, through negligence. The accusation was so absurd, so cruel that for a moment Alina could not even find words to respond. "That is a monstrous lie," she finally managed. "I have cared for Grace every hour since her illness began. I would never." "I know," Alexander said firmly, cutting off her protest before it could fully form. "I know it is a lie, Alina. I have already dismissed the accusation entirely. But Edmund is clever, and he has begun spreading the rumor beyond this household, to acquaintances in the county who might repeat it further." "Why would he do such a thing?" Alina asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Because he could not control you through fear of debt," Alexander said grimly. "So now he attempts to control you through fear of scandal. If your reputation is ruined thoroughly enough, no respectable household would ever employ you again, and you would have no choice but to leave, regardless of my wishes." "He is willing to destroy an innocent woman's future," Lady Constance said, and to Alina's surprise, the older woman's voice carried genuine outrage, simply to protect his own inheritance. "I confess, nephew, I did not believe even Edmund capable of such cruelty. I withdraw my earlier concerns entirely. Whatever objections I once held about Miss Whitfield's position in this household, they pale in comparison to the character she has shown these past days, and the character Edmund has revealed in himself." Alina felt tears prick at her eyes, both from the fear of what Edmund's rumors might cost her, and from unexpected gratitude at Lady Constance's sudden, fierce defense. "What must I do?" Alina asked. "Nothing," Alexander said firmly. "You will continue exactly as you have been. I will handle Edmund myself." His jaw was set with a hardness Alina had not seen in him before, a protective fury that left no doubt as to how seriously he took the threat against her. "He has overstepped for the final time in this household." That evening, Alexander confronted his cousin directly, and though Alina was not present for the conversation, she heard raised voices carrying down the corridor from the study, followed shortly after by the sound of a carriage being called for far earlier than Edmund's planned departure. Edmund left Ashworth Manor the following morning, his charming smile notably absent, his farewell to Alexander cold and clipped. He did not so much as glance in Alina's direction as his carriage pulled away down the long drive, and she felt the tension that had gripped the household for the better part of a week finally begin to ease. "It is not truly over," Alexander admitted to her later that day, as they walked together through the gardens, Grace, now fully recovered, running ahead of them chasing butterflies with the boundless energy only a child freshly returned to health could possess. "Edmund does not accept defeat gracefully. He will find some new avenue to pursue his interests, but for now, at least, he is gone and you are safe." "Thanks to you," Alina said softly. "Thanks to us," Alexander corrected, and the warmth in his voice as he said it made Alina's heart swell with a hope she could no longer bring herself to suppress. They watched Grace together in comfortable silence, and Alina found herself thinking, not for the first time, that this fractured, grieving household had somehow become the closest thing to a real family she had known since her own father's passing. Whatever obstacles still lay ahead, whatever schemes Edmund might yet attempt, she found herself unwilling to imagine a future that did not include this man beside her, and the small, laughing girl running through the roses ahead of them. The storm rolled in without warning on a Thursday evening, dark clouds swallowing the last light of day so quickly that the household barely had time to close the shutters before rain began hammering against the windows in furious sheets. Alina had put Grace to bed early that night, the child tired from a long day of lessons and play, and had retired to her own room to read by candlelight, the sound of thunder rumbling steadily closer. It was Mrs. Bennet's frantic knocking at her door, sometime past 10, that shattered the quiet. "Miss Whitfield, Grace is not in her bed," Mrs. Bennet said, her voice trembling with fear. "We have searched the nursery wing entirely. She is nowhere to be found." Alina's blood turned to ice. She threw on a shawl and rushed from her room, her heart pounding, her mind racing through every possibility. She found Alexander already in the main hallway, his face white with a terror Alina recognized instantly, the same terror that had gripped him the night she found him standing before his son's empty nursery. "We will find her," Alina said firmly, taking his arm before he could spiral further into panic. "She cannot have gone far. Where would she go?" It was one of the younger maids, trembling and near tears, who finally provided the answer they needed. "I saw a note on her pillow, Your Grace. I did not think to read it until just now." She held out a small scrap of paper, and Alexander snatched it from her hands, his eyes scanning the childish handwriting scrawled across it. "She has gone to find her mother," he read aloud, his voice breaking. "She writes that Lord Harcourt told her before he left that her parents were buried in the old chapel beyond the eastern woods, and that if she went there and prayed hard enough, perhaps she could see them again." Edmund told her this. Alina's fury nearly matched her fear. He filled a grieving child's head with false hope, knowing she might act on it. "He knew exactly what he was doing," Alexander said grimly, already moving toward the door, calling for lanterns and horses to be readied immediately. "If Grace is found wandering alone in a storm, if anything happens to her, it will be evidence enough for his petition. He does not care whether she lives or dies, Alina. He only cares that her disappearance makes me look unfit to guard her." They rode out together within minutes, along with several of the estate's grooms, into a storm that had grown fiercer by the moment, lightning splitting the sky in jagged white streaks, thunder crashing so close overhead that the horses shied and stamped nervously beneath them. Alina had never ridden in such conditions in her life, but fear for Grace's safety drove her forward without hesitation, matching Alexander's desperate pace through the darkened woods. The old chapel, when they finally reached it after nearly half an hour of frantic searching, stood in ruins at the edge of the estate's boundary, its roof partially collapsed, its graveyard overgrown with weeds and wildflowers that had claimed the crumbling headstones as their own. Two of them, newer than the rest, stood side by side beneath a great oak tree. Charlotte, Duchess of Ashworth, William Ashworth, beloved son. And there, huddled against the base of William's small headstone, soaked entirely through and shivering violently, was Grace. "Grace!" Alexander's voice cracked as he threw himself from his horse and ran to her, gathering the trembling child into his arms before Alina had even dismounted. "Grace, thank God you are safe." "I wanted to see them," Grace sobbed into his shoulder, her small body racked with cold and fear. "Lord Harcourt said if I came here and asked nicely, I might see them just once, and I only wanted to know if my mama and papa were happy, and if William was happy too, wherever he is." Alexander held her tightly, tears mixing freely with the rain streaming down his own face, and Alina felt her heart break entirely at the sight of this broken, grieving family finally, if painfully, coming together in the one place that held all their sorrow at once. "They would want you safe and warm, my darling," Alexander said, his voice thick with emotion. "They would want you here with me, not out in a storm risking your life for a wish that even I cannot grant you." They rode back to the manor as quickly as the storm would allow, Grace wrapped tightly in Alexander's coat, shivering but unharmed. And Alina's own relief was so overwhelming that she found herself weeping openly as they finally reached the safety of the house. Once Grace had been changed into dry clothes, warmed by the fire, and settled into a deep, exhausted sleep with Mrs. Bennet watching over her, Alexander finally allowed himself to collapse into a chair in his study, his composure entirely gone, his hands shaking as the full weight of what might have happened finally caught up with him. Alina knelt beside his chair, taking his trembling hands in her own. "She is safe, Alexander. She is safe and warm and sleeping soundly upstairs. You saved her." "We saved her," he corrected, echoing the words she had once used to comfort him. "I could not have found her without you. I could not have kept myself standing through any of this without you, Alina." He looked at her then, his eyes red-rimmed from tears and rain both, his guard entirely lowered for the first time since she had known him. "I have spent 3 years telling myself that loving anyone again would destroy me, that the risk of losing another person I cared for was simply too great to survive twice. Tonight, Riding through that storm, terrified of losing Grace, I understood something I had been too afraid to admit until now. "What is that?" Elinor whispered. "That I already love again," he said softly, his voice trembling with the confession. "I love Grace as though she were my own child. And I love you, Elinor, more than I ever believed myself capable of feeling after Charlotte. I have fought against it for weeks, terrified of what it might cost me if I lost you too, but tonight showed me that refusing to love does not protect a person from loss. It only ensures that whatever time we do have together is wasted in fear rather than lived in joy." Elinor's tears came freely now, though these were tears of overwhelming relief and happiness rather than fear. "I love you too, Alexander. I have loved you for weeks, though I told myself it was foolish, that a governess had no business losing her heart to a duke." "Foolish or not," he said, reaching up to gently brush a tear from her cheek, "it is the truest thing I have felt in 3 long years." He paused, his expression suddenly serious. "But Elinor, know that loving me means accepting a fight that is not yet finished. Edmund will not stop simply because tonight's scheme failed. If anything, Grace's safe return will only push him toward more desperate measures." "Then we will face whatever he attempts together," Elinor said firmly, "exactly as we found Grace together tonight." Alexander leaned forward, resting his forehead gently against hers, and for a long, quiet moment, neither of them spoke at all, simply grateful to have survived the night with everyone they loved safe and whole, and grateful, too, for the fragile, precious thing that had finally bloomed between them despite every fear that had stood in its way. The formal notice arrived 1 week after the storm, delivered by a stern-faced clerk who handed Alexander a sealed document with the solemnity of a man delivering very bad news indeed. Elinor watched from across the study as Alexander broke the seal and read the contents, his expression darkening with each line until, by the time he finished, his hands were gripping the paper so tightly it had begun to crumple at the edges. "He has filed a formal petition with the county magistrate," Alexander said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "He claims that Grace's near tragedy in the storm proves I am unfit to serve as her guardian, that my household is poorly managed, and that my, as he phrases it, improper attachment to a member of my household staff has compromised my judgment entirely." "Can he truly take her from you?" Elinor asked, fear gripping her chest at the thought of Grace being torn away from the only stable home she had known since her parents' passing. "He will try," Alexander said grimly. "A hearing has been set for a fortnight's time. Witnesses will be called. My conduct, my household, and yes, Elinor, your conduct as well, will all be examined before the magistrate and whatever gossips of the county choose to attend." The following days passed in a blur of anxious preparation. Alexander's solicitor arrived to review every detail of the household's management, interviewing staff, examining records, ensuring that no accusation Edmund might raise could find purchase in fact. Lady Constance, to Elinor's continued surprise, threw herself into the preparations with fierce determination, declaring that she would testify herself if it meant seeing Edmund's scheme fail entirely. "I raised concerns about your position in this household when I first arrived," Lady Constance admitted to Elinor one afternoon, as they sat together reviewing which household members might be called to testify. "I will admit that freely, but I have watched you these past weeks, Miss Whitfield. I have watched you nurse Grace through her fever, ride through a storm to save her life, and comfort my nephew through grief he has carried alone for far too long. Whatever objections I once held about propriety, they cannot outweigh the good you have done this family." "Thank you, my lady," Elinor said, genuinely moved. "Your support means more than you know." "Do not thank me yet," Constance said briskly, though not unkindly. "Edmund is a snake, and snakes do not simply slither away when cornered. He will produce whatever evidence, true or fabricated, that serves his purpose. We must be prepared for anything." Constance's warning proved accurate. When the hearing finally arrived, held in the county's modest assembly hall before a stern-faced magistrate and a gathering of curious onlookers, Edmund arrived with a witness Elinor had not anticipated at all, a former maid who had been dismissed from Ashworth Manor's service the previous year for theft, and who now claimed, under Edmund's careful coaching, that she had witnessed improper conduct between the Duke and his governess on multiple occasions. Elinor felt her stomach drop as the woman spoke, weaving a story of stolen moments and midnight meetings that bore no resemblance to the truth, yet sounded, to ears eager for scandal, entirely plausible. "This is a lie," Elinor whispered to Alexander, seated beside her, her hands trembling in her lap. "I know," he murmured back, his own composure remarkably steady despite the mounting tension in the room. "And lies, however convincing, crumble under proper scrutiny. Trust the solicitor, Elinor, trust the truth." When Alexander's solicitor rose to question the witness, it took remarkably little time to unravel her testimony entirely. A few pointed questions about dates, about the layout of the house she claimed to have witnessed these supposed meetings in, revealed inconsistencies so glaring that even the magistrate's stern expression softened into open skepticism. "You claim to have witnessed this conduct in the West Wing corridor," the solicitor said calmly, "and yet you were dismissed from service, by your own admission, 4 months before Miss Whitfield ever arrived at Ashworth Manor. How, precisely, could you have witnessed events involving a woman you had never met?" The witness stammered, unable to produce a coherent answer, and the assembled crowd began to murmur, the tide of public opinion shifting visibly against Edmund with each passing moment. Then Mrs. Bennet was called to testify, and she spoke with such fierce, unwavering loyalty about Elinor's genuine care for Grace, about the night of the storm, about the countless small kindnesses Elinor had shown the entire household since her arrival, that Elinor found herself moved to tears despite the tension of the proceedings. Finally, and most powerfully of all, Grace herself was called forward, and though Alexander had protested strongly against subjecting the child to such an ordeal, the magistrate insisted her testimony was relevant to the question of her own welfare. "Grace," the magistrate said gently, crouching slightly to meet the child's eyes at her own height, "do you feel safe at Ashworth Manor, with your uncle and Miss Whitfield?" Grace, though clearly nervous before the assembled crowd, answered without hesitation, "I have never felt safer anywhere, sir. Uncle Alexander and Miss Whitfield found me in the storm when I was frightened and cold, and they held me, and they never once made me feel foolish for wanting to see my mamma and papa again. Miss Whitfield teaches me every day, and she is kind, and she loves me, and I love her too. Lord Harcourt is the one who told me lies about seeing my parents if I went to the chapel alone. He is the one who put me in danger, not my uncle and not Miss Whitfield." The room fell utterly silent at the child's simple, devastating honesty, and Elinor watched Edmund's face drain of color as every eye in the assembly turned toward him with newfound understanding. The magistrate did not require much further deliberation. Within the hour, Edmund's petition was dismissed entirely, his witness's testimony discredited beyond repair, and Grace's own words leaving no doubt as to where her safety and happiness truly lay. Furthermore, given the clear evidence that Edmund had knowingly endangered a child's life through his manipulation, the magistrate saw fit to issue a formal warning against any future interference in Ashworth family matters, under threat of legal consequence. Edmund left the assembly hall without a word to anyone, his carriage disappearing down the road, with none of the confident swagger that had marked his arrival at Ashworth Manor weeks before. Elinor suspected, and hoped, that they had seen the last of his schemes for a very long time. That evening, back at the manor, the household celebrated quietly but warmly, relief and joy replacing the weeks of tension that had gripped everyone from the highest to the lowest position in the house. Grace, exhausted but proud of herself for speaking so bravely, fell asleep early, tucked safely into her bed with Elinor's promise to check on her throughout the night. Alexander found Elinor in the portrait gallery afterward, standing once more before Charlotte's painted image, though this time her expression held none of the sorrow it once had. "You are thinking of her," Alexander said softly, coming to stand beside her. "I am thinking that she would be glad," Elinor said, "to see you happy again, to see Grace safe and this house finally beginning to heal. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, studying the portrait of his late wife with an expression of peaceful acceptance Alina had never seen him wear before. I used to believe that loving you would be a betrayal of everything I felt for Charlotte. Tonight, watching Grace speak so bravely, watching you stand beside me through every trial Edmund threw at us, I understand now that it is not a betrayal at all. It is simply love continuing forward, exactly as Charlotte herself would have wanted for me. He turned to face Alina fully, taking both her hands in his own. Alina Whitfield, I do not wish to wait any longer, hiding behind propriety or fear of what others might say. I love you, entirely and without reservation, and I would like very much to make that love permanent if you will have me. Alina's breath caught in her throat, joy overwhelming every other feeling inside her. Alexander, nothing in this world would make me happier. He drew her close, and beneath the painted gaze of the woman who had once filled this house with warmth and laughter, Alexander Ashworth kissed Alina Whitfield for the first time, sealing a promise neither of them intended to break. A promise built not on the ashes of grief, but on the sturdy, hopeful foundation of love reborn. News of the engagement spread through the county faster than Alina could have imagined possible, and though she had braced herself for scorn and gossip, what she found instead surprised her entirely. Grace, when told the news the following morning, let out a delighted shriek and threw her arms around both of them at once, declaring immediately that she intended to help choose Alina's wedding gown and would insist on carrying flowers herself, a task she considered of the utmost importance. Lady Constance, who Alina had expected to raise fresh objections, instead embraced her warmly and declared that she had never been so pleased to be wrong about anything in her entire life. "You have brought my nephew back to life, Miss Whitfield," Constance said, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "I could not ask for a better match for him, title or no title." The servants, too, received the news with genuine joy rather than the scandalized whispers Alina had feared. Mrs. Bennet wept openly, declaring that she had known from the very first week that Alina was meant for something more than governess in this household, though she had never dared say so aloud until now. Not everyone in the county proved so generous, of course. There were whispers among certain families of standing, comments about a duke lowering himself to marry a woman of no fortune, questions about whether such a match could truly last given the difference in their positions. Alina heard some of these whispers directly. At a small gathering Lady Constance insisted on hosting to formally introduce her as Alexander's intended bride. "It is remarkable," one older woman remarked to another, not quite quietly enough, "how quickly some women manage to secure a fortune through nothing more than a pretty face and a well-timed tear." Alina felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, but before she could formulate any response, Alexander appeared at her side, having clearly overheard the comment as well. "I would remind you," he said coolly, addressing the woman directly with a formality that left no doubt as to his displeasure, "that Miss Whitfield rode through a violent storm to save my niece's life, faced down a malicious legal petition with grace and honesty, and has brought more warmth and healing to my household in a few short months than 3 years of my own efforts managed to achieve. I would consider it a personal favor if such remarks were not repeated in my presence again." The woman flushed and offered a hasty, stammering apology, and Alina felt a surge of gratitude and love so powerful it nearly brought tears to her eyes, watching this man who had once hidden behind cold formality now defend her so fiercely and openly before an entire room of society's judgment. "You did not need to do that," Alina said quietly, once they had stepped away from the gathering crowd. "I wanted to," Alexander said simply. "I spent 3 years allowing the opinions of others to convince me that love was a danger not worth the risk. I will not now allow those same opinions to diminish the woman I intend to marry." As the weeks passed and preparations for the wedding continued, one final matter remained unresolved, a matter Alina knew weighed heavily on Alexander's heart despite his growing happiness. The nursery, still locked, still frozen in the sorrow of 3 years past, remained the last untouched corner of grief in an otherwise healing household. It was Grace, in her innocent and unwaveringly honest way, who finally raised the subject directly. "Uncle Alexander," she said one evening, as the three of them sat together in the drawing room after supper, "will you and Miss Alina have a baby of your own once you are married?" Alexander's expression softened, though a familiar shadow of old grief passed briefly across his features. "Perhaps in time, Grace. Why do you ask?" "Because if you do," Grace said thoughtfully, "the baby will need a nursery, and I think William's old nursery is very sad the way it is now. I think he would want it to be a happy room again, for a new baby to play in, don't you think?" The room fell quiet, and Alina watched Alexander carefully, uncertain how he might respond to such a direct and unexpected suggestion from a child. To her relief and quiet joy, she saw not pain cross his face, but something closer to peace. "You may be right, Grace," he said softly. "I believe William would want exactly that." That night, once Grace had gone to bed, Alexander took Alina's hand and led her up the familiar staircase toward the third floor, toward the door neither of them had spoken of opening again since the very first night of Alina's arrival at the manor. "Are you certain?" Alina asked gently, as he paused before the nursery door, his hand hovering over the handle. "I have spent 3 years keeping this room exactly as it was," Alexander said quietly, "believing that preserving it meant preserving my son's memory, that changing anything within these walls would somehow erase him from existence entirely. But I understand now that memory does not require a shrine. It requires only love carried forward rather than grief held frozen in place." He opened the door, and together they stepped inside the small room that had haunted this household for so long. Alexander moved slowly through the space, running his fingers over the dusty cradle, the small wooden horse Alina had once held in her own trembling hands, the tiny gowns hanging untouched in the wardrobe. "I would like to keep a few things," he said softly, "as remembrance, but I think in time this room should become something new, something alive again." "We can do that together," Alina said, coming to stand beside him. "Whenever you are ready." He turned to her, his eyes glistening in the soft candlelight, and for the first time since she had known him, Alina saw a man who was no longer merely surviving his grief, but genuinely, hopefully, looking forward to whatever future awaited him. "Thank you," he said, "for unlocking more than just a door, Alina. Thank you for helping me find my way back to hope." She reached up and gently touched his face. "You found your own way back, Alexander. I simply happened to be standing beside you when you did." They left the nursery together that night, closing the door gently behind them, not in sorrow this time, but in quiet anticipation of the day it would finally be reopened for good, filled once more with laughter, with life, and with the promise of a future neither of them had believed themselves capable of hoping for only a few short months before. The wedding took place on a bright autumn morning, the kind of clear golden day that seemed, to everyone in attendance, like a gift after the storms and struggles of the preceding months. Ashworth Manor's small chapel, long unused for anything but somber occasions, had been filled with white roses and warm candlelight for the occasion. And as Alina walked down the aisle on the arm of Mr. Grant, the estate steward who had kindly offered to stand in for the father she no longer had, she felt none of the nervousness she might have expected, only a deep, settled certainty that she was walking toward exactly where she was meant to be. Grace, positioned proudly at the front of the chapel with a small basket of flower petals, beamed with such obvious joy that several guests could not help but smile at the sight of her. And Lady Constance, seated in the front pew, dabbed at her eyes throughout the entire ceremony, declaring afterward that she had cried more happy tears that day than she had in the previous decade combined. Alexander stood waiting at the altar, and when Alina finally reached him, the look on his face, open and unguarded and utterly full of love, was one she knew she would carry in her heart for the rest of her life. "You look radiant," he whispered, as the vicar began the ceremony. "You look like a man who has finally stopped running from his own happiness," she whispered back, and the small, genuine smile that broke across his face confirmed just how true her words were. They exchanged their vows before the assembled guests, promises of love and partnership and unwavering support through whatever future challenges life might bring. And when the vicar finally pronounced them husband and wife, the chapel erupted in warm applause, Grace's delighted cheering rising above it all. News had reached them only days before the wedding that Edmund Harcourt had quietly sold his claim to the estate's secondary properties and departed for the continent, apparently having finally accepted that his schemes in England had run entirely out of options. Whether he intended to build a new life elsewhere or simply escape the humiliation of his defeat, Alina could not say, and found she cared very little either way. Their household, at last, was free of his shadow entirely. The wedding celebration continued long into the evening, filled with music and laughter that seemed to shake loose years of accumulated sorrow from the very walls of Ashworth Manor. Alina danced with Alexander beneath strings of lantern light in the garden, danced with Grace, who insisted on standing on her new uncle's feet during at least one song, and danced even with Lady Constance, who proved, to everyone's delighted surprise, to be a rather enthusiastic dancer herself once properly encouraged. It was several weeks after the wedding, once the household had settled into its new and happier rhythm, that Alexander suggested finally beginning the work of transforming the nursery. They approached the task together, and slowly, carefully, the room began to change. The heavy velvet drapes that had blocked out sunlight for 3 long years were taken down, and replaced with lighter, brighter curtains that let warm afternoon light spill freely across the floor. The old cradle, William's cradle, was cleaned and polished with gentle care, and rather than being removed entirely, Alexander decided it should remain, a quiet remembrance rather than a shrine, positioned now near a cheerful window overlooking the garden rather than facing the shadowed corner it had once occupied. Grace helped choose new colors for the walls, a soft, warm yellow that she declared looked exactly like sunshine, and together the 3 of them, along with several of the household staff who had watched this room's slow transformation with quiet joy of their own, filled the space with new toys, new furnishings, and an atmosphere of hopeful anticipation rather than frozen grief. "It feels different now," Grace observed, standing in the center of the freshly painted room, sunlight streaming warmly across the polished floor. "It feels happy." "It does," Alexander agreed, and Alina, watching him survey the transformed room with an expression of peaceful contentment rather than old sorrow, felt her heart swell with quiet pride at how far this man had traveled since the night she had first stumbled into his private grief. That evening, once Grace had gone to bed, and the household had settled into its familiar quiet, Alina found Alexander standing once more in the newly transformed nursery, running his hand gently along the edge of William's cradle. "I used to believe," he said softly, as Alina came to stand beside him, "that keeping this room locked and unchanged was the only way to honor my son's memory. That any alteration would somehow mean I had stopped loving him, stopped grieving him properly." He looked up at her, his eyes warm with an emotion far gentler than the grief that had once consumed him entirely. "I understand now that love does not require a room frozen in time to remain real. William will always be my son, always be loved, whether this room stays exactly as it once was or grows and changes alongside the rest of our lives." Alina slipped her hand into his. "He would be proud of the father you have become, Alexander, proud of the family you have built, even through such terrible loss." "Our family," Alexander corrected gently, drawing her close. "Yours and mine and Grace's, and whatever future children we may be blessed with. This room is ready for them now, whenever they arrive, filled with hope instead of sorrow, exactly as William himself would have wanted it." They stood together in the transformed nursery, sunlight fading gently into the soft colors of evening outside the window, and Alina felt, more strongly than she ever had before, that the promise Alexander had once made to himself, the promise to never love again, had not been broken by her arrival in his life. It had simply been proven false by the very nature of love itself, a force too powerful and too persistent to remain locked away forever, no matter how tightly a grieving heart tried to hold the door shut. Some promises, she realized, were never meant to be kept. Some were meant only to be gently, patiently unlocked, one small act of courage at a time, until the light finally came flooding back in. A year passed at Ashworth Manor, and the house that had once stood silent and shadowed now rang constantly with the sound of laughter, footsteps, and life. Elinor sat by the nursery window on a warm spring morning, a small bundle held gently in her arms, watching sunlight dance across the same floor that had once been kept dark and untouched for 3 long grieving years. Her daughter, born only weeks earlier, and named Charlotte in honor of the woman whose portrait still hung proudly in the gallery below, slept peacefully against her chest, her tiny fingers curled around Elinor's own. Alexander entered quietly, careful not to wake the sleeping infant, and settled beside them with an expression of such complete contentment that Elinor found it difficult to remember the guarded, grieving man she had first encountered on that stormy night so long ago. "Grace has been asking all morning when she may hold her cousin again," Alexander said softly, smiling down at his daughter. "I believe she intends to teach little Charlotte everything she knows before the poor child can even walk." "She will make a wonderful older sister figure," Elinor said, laughing quietly. "Though I suspect Charlotte may grow tired of quite so many stories read to her before she can even understand them." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, watching their daughter sleep in the very room that had once held nothing but sorrow. The wooden horse that Elinor had picked up on her very first night at the manor now sat proudly on a shelf near the window, no longer a symbol of frozen grief, but a cherished reminder of the son who had come before, and the family who had grown from the ashes of that terrible loss into something stronger and more hopeful than anyone could have predicted. Lady Constance visited often now, delighting in her role as doting great-aunt, and had become, much to everyone's amusement, one of little Charlotte's most devoted admirers, frequently arriving with gifts far too extravagant for an infant who could not yet appreciate them. Mrs. Bennet, too, had taken to spoiling the newest addition to the household at every opportunity, declaring that Ashworth Manor finally felt exactly as a family home should feel. Of Edmund Harcourt, little was heard beyond occasional rumors reaching them from acquaintances abroad, tales of a man drifting from one venture to another, never quite settling, never quite finding the fortune or position he had once so desperately sought to seize through cruelty and manipulation. Elinor found she felt no bitterness toward him any longer, only a distant, quiet pity for a man who had never learned that love, freely given, was worth infinitely more than any title or inheritance he might have claimed through fear and deception. One evening, as summer approached and the gardens outside bloomed richly with color, Alexander and Elinor walked together through the portrait gallery, little Charlotte sleeping soundly in her father's arms while Grace skipped ahead of them, chattering happily about the butterflies she had spotted earlier that day. They paused, as they often did, before the portrait of Charlotte, the first Duchess, her warm smile forever captured in painted oils, watching over the family that had grown and healed in the years since her passing. "I think she would be glad," Elinor said softly, echoing words she had spoken once before, in a very different moment, when hope had still felt fragile and uncertain. "I know she would," Alexander said, his voice steady and full of peace rather than the old grief it once carried. "She would be glad to see this house filled with laughter again, glad to see Grace so happy and our daughter so loved, and glad, I think, most of all, to see that I finally learned to stop being afraid of loving fully again." He turned to look at Elinor, his eyes warm with a devotion that had only deepened with each passing month of their marriage. "You unlocked far more than a nursery door that first night, Elinor. You unlocked a part of myself I had believed lost forever, a part I thought had died alongside Charlotte and William. I will spend the rest of my life grateful that you refused to let that door, or my heart, remain closed." Elinor leaned into him, resting her head gently against his shoulder as they watched their daughter sleep peacefully in her father's arms, and Grace's happy laughter echoed down the corridor ahead of them, filling the once silent halls of Ashworth Manor with the warm, unmistakable sound of a family finally, fully healed. Outside, the summer sun continued to climb higher over the gardens, casting warm golden light through every window of the house, chasing away the last remaining shadows of a grief that had once seemed permanent, and illuminating instead a future built entirely on love, patience, and the quiet, unbreakable courage of a woman who had dared to unlock a door no one else had ever been brave enough to open.